Have you ever felt that you weren't truly loved? Not that no one loved you, but that even when you were in a relationship, you were just playing a role. You tried to be kind. You listened. You gave. You stayed. But the more you tried to be good, the more invisible you felt, like you were slowly disappearing into someone else's dream. I've been there, and I know millions of men are living that quiet confusion right now. And then one day, I came across a line by Carl Jung. It stopped me cold. People don't fall in love with you. They fall in love with the projection of you that lives in their own unconscious. You think you're being loved, but in reality, you're being imagined. And when you no longer fit the fantasy in her mind, she doesn't change the story. She changes the actor. In the next few minutes, we're going to peel back the layers of modern love and look at it through Carl Jung's most unsettling ideas, projection the animus, and the terrifying truth about why good men keep getting left behind. You'll discover why women often fall in love with your potential, not your truth. Why being the nice guy usually makes you the most disposable, and why Jung believed you only become a free man when you stop auditioning for someone else's fantasy. This isn't a video about blaming women. It's a wake-up call for men who are still waiting to be chosen instead of choosing themselves. And if you have the courage to face the truths that most people never dare to look at, come with me. It starts now. It usually starts with a look. She sees you not as you are, but as who you might become. There's a flicker in her eyes. You feel it. It's soft, almost magical. Like she sees something in you that even you forgot was there. And it feels good, doesn't it? To be seen, to be admired, to be chosen. But here's the truth. No one tells you. You're not being seen. You're being imagined. She's not falling in love with your quiet mornings, your unresolved doubts, or your silent fears. She's falling for an idea, an inner image her mind has already written. You are the actor. Her unconscious is the director, and the script, you never even got to read it. Let me tell you a story. A friend of mine, let's call him James, was in a relationship for 3 years. From the outside, it looked perfect. She adored him. Always said, "You're different from all the other guys." But here's what James told me one night after their breakup. I don't think she ever really knew me. She knew who she hoped I was. And when I stopped living up to that, she just detached. See, in the beginning, James was exciting. He had ambition, confidence, mystery. But when he got vulnerable, when he admitted he didn't have everything figured out, she pulled away. Not cruelly, just quietly, because the fantasy couldn't handle the reality. Carl Jung warned us about this. He wrote that we rarely fall in love with people as they are. We fall in love with what they symbolize, with the missing piece in us. And when the illusion cracks, we don't fix it. We blame them. We leave. Here's the quiet tragedy. Most men don't realize they're not being loved. They just think they've disappointed someone again. So they try harder. They perform better. They suppress more. Until eventually, they lose touch with who they were before they were cast in someone else's movie. So here's the lesson. If you feel like you're constantly trying to be enough for her, if love feels like performance, you're not in a relationship, you're in a projection. And the first step toward freedom is recognizing that, but it goes deeper. Because if women are unconsciously projecting, what exactly are they projecting? Where does that inner image of the ideal man come from? Carl Jung had a name for it. He called it the Animus. And what he discovered about it will change the way you see women and yourself forever. To understand what really happens in many relationships, we have to go deeper beneath the surface. beneath the smiles, the sweet words, the soft intimacy, into the subconscious. Carl Jung believed that every human being carries within them an opposite inner image. For men, it's the anima, the inner feminine. For women, it's the animus, the inner masculine. The animus isn't just a vague idea of masculine energy. It's a complex inner voice, a silent narrator inside her psyche. And when left unconscious, it can completely hijack the way she sees men. Let me explain. When a woman hasn't examined or integrated her animus, she doesn't just fall in love with you. She falls in love with the inner man she's been building in her mind since childhood. The strong one, the mysterious one, the savior, the rebel, the mind reader, the flawless ideal who always knows what to do and never makes her uncomfortable. It's not her fault. This image comes from childhood impressions media father wounds culture trauma. And once it's formed, every real man she meets is subconsciously compared to it. I once spoke with a woman deeply intelligent, self-aware, who admitted something that most never say out loud. Sometimes I realize I'm not really listening to who he is. I'm measuring him against this blueprint in my head. And when he doesn't match it, I feel angry. Not because he did something wrong, but because he's not who I secretly hoped he'd be. That's the animus at work. It doesn't just influence who she's attracted to, it filters reality. Here's the dangerous part. When a woman's animus is immature or wounded, it doesn't serve her, it rules her. It makes her chase men who are emotionally unavailable, or try to fix good men who don't match the fantasy. It fuels arguments that make no logical sense. It projects moral superiority. It dominates. It judges. And worst of all, it believes it's always right. Not because she's a bad person, but because she's being possessed by an image she hasn't questioned. Jung called this a spiritual possession. Because the woman begins to act not from her heart, but from an unconscious masculine force inside her. One she doesn't even know is speaking through her. Here's the lesson for you. If you've ever felt like you're being punished for things you didn't do, or like you're constantly failing to measure up, but don't know why, you might not be failing. You just might not be him, not the man she imagined, not the fantasy she's attached to. And no matter how hard you try, you'll never win against someone else's ghost. So, what can you do? You can't change her inner image. You can't fix her animus. But you can understand why you're being cast in a role and decide if you want to keep playing it. But before we talk about how to walk away from the script, we need to look at something most men never realize. Why do we fall for this trap in the first place? Why do we stay in relationships where we're being imagined instead of understood? That answer, as painful as it is, has everything to do with us. There's a certain kind of warmth in her eyes, a certain energy in the way she leans in when you speak. She laughs at your jokes. She says, "You're not like the others." And in that moment, something inside you softens. You feel seen. You feel chosen. You feel connected. But what if I told you that what you felt wasn't connection at all? What if it was just attention wrapped in projection? You see, many men, especially those of us who were never taught emotional grounding, have a deep unspoken hunger. The hunger to be seen, to be validated, to feel enough. And so, when a woman showers us with admiration, when she says all the right things and looks at us with stars in her eyes, we mistake it for real intimacy. But what we're actually receiving is a reflection of her fantasy, not an understanding of our soul. Let me tell you a story. A man I coached, let's call him Leo, told me about his last breakup. He said, "She said I was perfect for months. that I was everything she ever wanted. And then one day, she looked at me like I was a stranger. I hadn't changed, but she had. It felt like I'd been fired from a job I never applied for. That's what happens when attention is mistaken for connection. When you're not being loved for who you are, just for how well you fit into the story someone else is telling. And here's the trap. Because it feels so good to be wanted, you don't stop to ask, do they really know me? You silence your doubts. You ignore the red flags. You keep performing because you don't want to lose the role. Why do we do it? Because we were raised to believe that being chosen is proof of our worth, that a man isn't truly a man unless a woman approves. So we crave that spotlight, even if it burns us. We fear solitude. We fear being alone with our own silence. So we settle for being misunderstood, as long as it feels like affection. But here's the truth. Attention is not connection. Admiration is not love. Being desired is not the same as being seen. And until you know the difference, you'll keep falling into relationships where you're only half alive, half honest, half you. So what's the way out? According to Carl Jung, the first step is to realize that this cycle, this constant need to be chosen, is rooted in the parts of ourselves we've never dared to face. In the next part, we'll explore something that sounds almost mystical, but it's very real. Jung called it psychological possession, a state where you're no longer living from your own truth, but from the image someone else has cast upon you. And the worst part, most of us don't even notice it's happening. Have you ever tried to explain yourself to someone only to feel like they weren't even hearing you? Not because they weren't listening, but because somehow their version of you was louder than your actual voice. Carl Jung had a name for this. He called it psychological possession. It sounds dramatic, almost spiritual. But in reality, it happens every day. In marriages, in dating, in friendships. It happens when someone becomes so attached to the fantasy in their mind that they begin to treat it as real, and they expect you to act accordingly. Let me paint you a picture. A man, let's call him Daniel, once told me about a moment in his relationship that changed everything. He had been dating a woman who described him as a rock, so grounded, never emotional. She admired how steady he was. Then one evening, he broke down. Work had pushed him to the edge. He lost someone close to him. He cried not dramatically, just honestly, quietly, and she froze. "I don't know who you are right now," she whispered. She wasn't angry. She wasn't cruel. But in that moment, the image in her mind shattered, and she didn't know how to relate to the real man sitting in front of her. That's psychological possession. When her internal image becomes more real to her than you. Jung believed that when we are deeply unconscious, we no longer see people for who they are. We interact with projections, and when those projections take over, something eerie happens. We stop responding to reality. We start reacting to a story, one that only exists in our head. And if someone threatens that story, we don't question the story. We attack the person. This is what happens in countless relationships. When the man stops playing the expected role, he's not simply disappointing her. He's disrupting her reality. That's why it feels so intense, so emotional, so unfair. Because to her unconscious mind, you didn't just change, you betrayed the fantasy. Here's the lesson. When someone's inner world is louder than the outer one, no amount of logic, kindness, or love will reach them. You can explain yourself, clarify, apologize, but it won't matter because they're not talking to you. They're arguing with their own expectations. So, what do? You stop trying to fight a ghost. You step back. You see it for what it is. Not a failure of love, but a failure of awareness. You can't force someone to wake up from their projection, but you can choose whether or not you keep playing along. And here's where most men get stuck. They sense something is off, but they don't understand why they keep performing. Why do we stay in the role even when it hurts? To answer that, we have to look at what's going on inside us. Because as much as we talk about her projection, we also have one of our own. At some point, many men come to the same conclusion. If I'm kind enough, patient enough, respectful enough, she'll stay. She'll choose me. She'll love me. So you become the good guy. You pick up her calls. You agree to her needs. You tone down your opinions. You make yourself safe, soft, predictable. You think you're building connection, but what you're actually doing without realizing it is performing. This is the trap that Carl Jung warned us about. When a man lives not from his truth, but from a role that's been rewarded by others, he loses touch with his inner voice. And when you do that long enough, you become forgettable. Not because you're not valuable, but because you've become too easy to define. Let me share a story. A man named Aaron once told me, "I thought being the good guy was the answer. I always showed up. I always listened. I never raised my voice. And somehow, she left me for a guy who didn't even treat her half as well." He wasn't bitter. He was heartbroken and confused. Because no one tells men the dark side of performance. When you make yourself too available, too agreeable, too safe, you stop being a mystery. And when the mystery dies, so does attraction. Here's the thing. Being kind is good. Being respectful is essential. But when your goodness comes from fear of being alone, fear of not being chosen, fear of upsetting her, then it's no longer kindness. It's manipulation in disguise. A quiet attempt to earn love by becoming someone you think she wants. But the cost, you lose yourself. Jung believed that a man who performs for affection is not really alive. He's a mask, a mirror, a servant to the projections of others. And in the end, he's the easiest to walk away from, because you can't miss someone who was never fully there to begin with. So here's the lesson. Don't trade your truth for comfort. Don't become so agreeable that you disappear. Love that's built on performance is never love. It's theater. And every play eventually ends. But if performance isn't the answer, what is? If we want to stop being masks, we have to start the deeper journey. Jung called it individuation, a path not of becoming what she wants, but becoming who you truly are. It's not glamorous, it's not quick, and it's definitely not easy, but it's the only way to stop being a puppet in someone else's story and become the author of your own. There comes a moment, quiet, often painful, when a man realizes something isn't working anymore. The roles he's played, the smiles he's forced, the approval he's chased, none of it makes him feel whole. And that's when the real journey begins. Carl Jung called it individuation, a lifelong process of becoming who you truly are. Not the version your parents wanted, not the mask society rewards, and not the fantasy someone projected onto you, but you, raw, unfiltered, awake. Individuation isn't about perfection. It's about wholeness. It's about facing all the parts of you you've buried, the fear, the doubt, the anger, the shame, and learning to integrate them, not hide from them. Because you can't be a whole man if you're only willing to live with half your truth. Let me share a story. A man named Elijah once told me that after his second divorce, he stopped dating altogether for 2 years, not out of bitterness, but because he realized he didn't even know who he was without a relationship. Every time I loved someone, he said, I disappeared a little bit. I became what they needed. I gave up my voice to keep the peace. And one day, I looked in the mirror, and I didn't recognize the man staring back, so he stopped performing. He sat with his loneliness. He journaled. He went to therapy. He hiked in silence. He read Jung, meditated, faced his shadows, and slowly, painfully, beautifully, he began to come home to himself. That is individuation, not a dramatic transformation, but a deep remembering, a return to something more honest than image, more enduring than attraction, more powerful than being chosen. Here's the truth Jung gave us. You don't become a man by being loved. You become a man by learning to live without needing to be. When you no longer chase approval, when you no longer fear being misunderstood, you become grounded. And that groundedness, it changes everything. Your presence sharpens. Your boundaries strengthen. Your energy becomes quiet, but undeniable. You're no longer acting. You're just real. But this path isn't easy. And the closer you get to wholeness, the more resistance you'll meet. Because not everyone wants to meet a man who no longer needs to perform, especially women who are still attached to the fantasy. So what happens then? In the next part, we'll talk about why you can't save her and why trying to fix her animus might be the very thing keeping you from your freedom. It's one of the most seductive lies a man can believe. If I love her enough, I can fix her. If I stay patient, if I show up, if I never give up, she'll finally soften. She'll finally see me. She'll finally heal. And maybe she'll finally love me the way I've always needed to be loved. This is the beginning of what Jung would call the savior complex. It doesn't feel like ego. It feels like devotion, like being the better man, the one who doesn't run when things get messy. But underneath it is the quiet, aching belief that her healing is your job, and that if you succeed in healing her, then maybe you'll finally be enough. Let me tell you a story. A man I knew, Thomas, was in a relationship with a woman who had been through deep emotional trauma. He knew this from the start. She was distant, hot and cold. She projected. She accused. She pulled away, then clung tightly. But Thomas was patient. He read books. He watched videos on trauma bonding. He kept saying to himself, she just needs someone who won't give up on her, and I'll be that man. But after 2 years of holding space, she left. Not with a thank you. Not with closure. Just silence. And Thomas was left shattered not just by her absence, but by the crushing realization that his love hadn't saved her, or himself. Here's what Jung would say. You cannot carry her soul. You cannot do the shadow work for her. You cannot integrate her animus. You cannot awaken someone who is not yet ready to wake up. And trying to do so, it doesn't make you noble. It makes you lost. You see, the savior complex often comes from a man who doesn't feel whole within himself. So he searches for a mission. He makes her wounds his purpose, because fixing her feels easier than facing his own unmet needs. But here's the painful truth. The woman who hasn't faced her own shadows will turn against the man who tries to bring light into them, not because he's wrong, but because he becomes a mirror. And sometimes the mirror is too much. So what's the lesson? You can love, you can support, you can hold space, but you cannot save her. You cannot walk her path. You cannot make her ready. You cannot sacrifice your own sanity on the altar of her healing. True love doesn't mean doing her work. It means respecting her process while staying rooted in your own. And here's the good news. When you finally release the burden of fixing her, you create space for something far more powerful. You make room for a kind of love that is not based on need, but on truth. The kind that doesn't ask for performance. The kind that doesn't reward self-abandonment. The kind of love that can only happen when two whole people choose each other freely. But for that to happen, you must first become the kind of man who no longer needs to be chosen at all. Let's talk about him. There's something quietly powerful about a man who doesn't need anything from you. He listens not to respond, but to understand. He moves not to impress, but to live. And when you look into his eyes, there's no grasping, no pleading, no desperation, just presence, solid, still, whole. That's the man who has learned to stand alone. And ironically, that's the man who draws people in. Not by chasing, not by pleasing, but by being. Carl Jung believed that true maturity begins when we stop outsourcing our sense of self. When we no longer look to lovers, friends, or applause to tell us we're enough. This is what he meant by individuation, the journey of returning to yourself so fully that you no longer seek completion in others. And when a man gets there, when he truly belongs to himself, he becomes magnetic, because wholeness is rare, and rare things attract. Let me tell you a story. A man named Adam went through a brutal breakup. He'd built his identity around being the perfect boyfriend. He cooked. He planned dates. He never missed a birthday. But deep down, he always feared losing her. And when she left, that fear became reality. At first, he spiraled. But then something shifted. Instead of jumping into another relationship, he sat with the emptiness. He traveled. He spent time in silence. He started doing things for himself, not for someone's validation. And one day over coffee, he said, "For the first time in my life, I'm not performing. I'm not waiting to be chosen. I just like the man I'm becoming." That is emotional independence, not coldness, not isolation, but the kind of self-respect that says, "I'm already whole. You're welcome to walk beside me, but I no longer need you to complete me." And here's what most men don't realize. When you stop needing her to approve of you, she feels it. Your energy shifts. You become a mystery again. Not because you're hiding, but because you're no longer predictable. You're no longer acting from fear. You're anchored. And anchored men are unforgettable. So here's the lesson. Stop proving. Start being. Let go of the need to be seen a certain way and become a man who can stand in silence without reaching for applause. Because in that stillness, you'll find the version of yourself that's truly magnetic. But this level of awareness doesn't come without a cost. Because when you stop performing, when you stop playing the expected role, you will be misunderstood. Not everyone will celebrate the man you've become. In fact, some will resent you for it. In the next part, we'll explore why the individuated man is often feared and what it really means to become untouchable. There comes a moment quiet unannounced, when the illusion breaks, when the fantasy fades, when the masks fall, and all that's left is you, just as you are. No performance, no edits, no filters. It can feel terrifying. But it's also where real love begins, because real love doesn't fall in love with the potential of a person. It chooses the presence of one. Carl Jung taught us that most relationships begin with projection, and many never leave it. We fall for an image, a symbol, a feeling we once longed for now, seemingly found in another. But it's not truly them we're loving. It's the version of ourselves we've assigned to them, the missing piece we think they'll complete. And that's why so often, the very person we once adored becomes the person we resent. Not because they changed, but because they stopped matching the story we wrote in our heads. Let me tell you a story. Claire and Michael had been married for 7 years. In the beginning, it was electric, passionate, purposeful. She saw him as strong, stoic, grounded. He saw her as nurturing, radiant, wise. But over time, they both grew. Michael began to open up more emotionally. Claire began questioning her desire to always be the supportive one. And slowly, the roles they had assigned each other, without even realizing it, started to crumble. One night during a long conversation, Claire said, "I don't think I ever really saw you. I saw who I needed you to be." There was sadness, but also relief. Because for the first time, they were finally seeing each other without the veil. That's the death of projection and the birth of something far more rare, real love. Not the kind that demands, not the kind that clings, but the kind that simply says, "I see you." Not for what I want you to be, but for who you are. And I choose you anyway. Here's the lesson. Real love doesn't begin when someone sees your best self. It begins when they witness your full self, flaws, fears, confusion, and stay, not because they need you, but because they respect you. And for that to happen, you have to show up as your whole self. Not the hero, not the fixer, not the fantasy, just you. But here's the paradox. Most people will never experience this kind of love. Not because it doesn't exist, but because it requires two people who have both done their inner work. Two people who've faced their shadows, who've shattered the illusion, and are ready to meet fully awake. So how do you know when you've arrived there? What does it look like when a man has finally become whole? In the final part, we'll answer that. We'll explore what it means to be the man who no longer performs because he no longer needs to. A man who lives in truth and walks in freedom. Let's finish this journey together. Imagine this. You walk into a room. You don't say much. You don't try to prove anything. And yet, people notice. They don't know why, but they feel something. That's not charisma. That's not charm. That's presence. The quiet gravity of a man who no longer performs. Carl Jung believed that the most powerful man is not the loudest, not the strongest, not the most successful, but the one who has become whole. A man who has stared into the dark corners of his psyche and didn't flinch. Who no longer needs applause to feel worthy. Who no longer wears a mask just to be loved. A man who simply is. Let me share one final story. A client of mine, Jason, had spent years building an identity around being the dependable guy. He showed up for everyone. At work, at home, in relationships. He thought that if he never failed anyone, he'd never be left behind. But inside, he was exhausted, resentful, lost. One day, in our session, he said, "I'm tired of being everything for everyone and nothing for myself." That was his turning point. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just a quiet decision to stop performing, to start being. He began saying no more. He started journaling, not to impress, but to understand. He started dating not to be chosen, but to choose. And over time, his energy shifted. Women responded differently. Colleagues noticed. Even his friends said, "Something's different about you." But the truth was simple. Jason had finally stopped chasing the role and started living the reality. So here's the final lesson. When you stop performing, you begin living. You no longer react, you respond. You no longer seek to be defined, you define. You no longer look for someone to complete you because you're already whole. And when you become that man, you'll attract not fantasy, but truth. Not control, but connection. Not applause, but respect. This isn't the end. It's the beginning. The beginning of a life lived from the inside out. Rooted, honest, free. So if you've made it this far, thank you, truly, because most won't. Most will keep performing, keep chasing, keep pretending, but not you. You're awake now. If this journey spoke to you, don't let it stop here. Like this video. Share it with a man who needs it. And if you're ready to keep walking the path with us, subscribe, not for the algorithm, but for the man you're becoming. Let's keep walking one honest step at a time.